The red Zen-faced demon of the mountains, and the samurai feared it. Welcome to Shadow Folklore. Today, the Tengu. The mountain path narrows as it climbs. Pine needles carpet the stone, centuries of them, compressed into a silence that swallows footsteps. The air thins. Each breath comes shallow, tinged with the mineral cold of high altitude, and the faint resin smell of cryptomeria bark. Above, the canopy parts in jagged intervals, revealing nothing but the gradient of dusk, indigo bleeding into charcoal, the last thermal light draining from the western ridges. No birds call the wind. When it comes, does not gust. It breathes, a long, sustained exhalation through the ravines, carrying with it the smell of snow that has not yet fallen, and the distant sound of something like laughter, high and thin. From a throat that might not be human, the path bends around an outcrop of moss, and slick granite below. The valley floor is lost to cloud. Above, the summit remains invisible, somewhere beyond the tree line, where the forest gives way to scree, and the air turns too thin for speech. This is the domain of the Yamabushi, the mountain ascetics who wander these heights in white robes and conch shell horns, seeking enlightenment through deprivation and discipline. But it is also the domain of something older, something that was here before the monasteries, before the first human foot touched these stones. In the gaps between the trees, shadows pool in shapes that do not quite match the architecture of branch and trunk. And if you listen, if you stand perfectly still and let the wind pass over you like water, you might hear the rustling of feathers, the scrape of talons on rock, the low, amused growl of a voice that has watched empires rise and collapse, and found them all equally absurd. This is where the Tengu dwell. The Tengu are among the oldest and most mutable figures in Japanese spiritual life, predating the codification of Shinto as a formal religious system and surviving through every major cultural transformation that followed. They are not gods, though they possess divine power. They are not demons, though they have been cast as such. They are not animals, though they wear the faces of crows and the talons of raptors. They are intermediaries, tricksters, teachers, and harbingers, beings that exist in the fault lines between categories, in the spaces where human order breaks down and the wild intelligence of the mountain reasserts itself. The word Tengu, Tengo, Pengo, means literally heavenly dog. The term entered Japanese usage in the 8th century, borrowed from Chinese Buddhist texts, where it referred to celestial phenomena, meteors, comets, falling stars. In the Nihon Shoki, the oldest chronicle of Japanese history, compiled in Xiaolin, there is a passage describing a brilliant object that streaked across the sky in the year Liu Sensi, producing a sound like thunder. Observers called it a Tengu. The implication was clear. These were not creatures of flesh and bone, but atmospheric events, omens written in fire across the heavens, harbingers of war or dynastic collapse. Early Japanese cosmology made little distinction between meteorological and spiritual phenomena. A storm was an expression of divine anger. An eclipse was a signal of cosmic disorder, and the appearance of a Tengu, a streak of light tearing through the night, was a warning that the boundary between the human world and the realm of the kami, the spirits, had grown dangerously thin. But by the Heian period, the Tengu had undergone a profound transformation. They descended from the sky and took up residence in the mountains. They acquired bodies, avian, human. They developed personalities, hierarchies, and a taste for mischief that ranged from the benign to the catastrophic. The earliest textual descriptions of Tengu as corporeal beings appear in the Konjaku Monogatari, a collection of Buddhist tales compiled in the early 12th century. Here, they are depicted as malevolent spirits that inhabit remote peaks and prey on monks who have strayed from the path of enlightenment. They possess the arrogant, the vain, and the spiritually complacent, driving them to madness or luring them into the wilderness to die of exposure. In one story, a monk who has grown proud of his learning is visited by a Tengu in the guise of a beautiful woman. She leads him deep into the forest, promising secret knowledge. When he follows, the illusion dissolves, and he finds himself alone on a cliff edge, surrounded by the mocking laughter of invisible voices. The Tengu of the Heian period, were shape-jan shifters, capable of assuming any form, human, animal, or elemental, but their most iconic appearance, the one that would define them for the next millennium, was that of a hybrid creature, the body of a man, the wings of a bird, and a face marked by two unmistakable features: crimson skin and a long protruding nose. The red face was a marker of rage, of uncontrolled passion, of the fires of attachment that Buddhist doctrine warned against. The nose, meanwhile, was a subject of endless speculation. Some scholars have argued that it was a phallic symbol, representing unchecked masculine aggression. Others have suggested that it was a visual shorthand for arrogance, a physical manifestation of spiritual pride. Still others have noted that it may have been influenced by depictions of foreign peoples, Central Asian monks or traders from the Silk Road, whose features seemed strange and exaggerated to Japanese eyes. The mountains where the Tengu lived were not abstract settings. They were real, named places, charged with spiritual significance. Mount Kurama, just northeast of Kyoto, was said to be the stronghold of Sfei Jefei Bifei, the king of the Tengu, a being of such immense power that even the gods hesitated to confront him. Mount Takao, on the western edge of what is now Tokyo, was home to a Tengu named Naigubu, who guarded the sacred trails and tested the resolve of ascetics, who sought enlightenment through pilgrimage. Mount Otago, where the warrior monks of the Tendai sect maintained their monasteries, was believed to be a threshold between the human and spirit worlds, a place where the veil was thin and Tengu sightings were common. These were not wilderness areas in the modern sense. They were working landscapes, inhabited by loggers, hunters, charcoal burners, and itinerant monks. But they were also liminal zones, places where the rules of settled society did not apply, where the authority of the emperor and the teachings of the Buddha could be challenged or ignored. The Tengu reflected this ambiguity, but they were never wholly benign. They operated according to their own logic. They terrorized monks, who had grown complacent in their practice. But they also served as teachers to warriors, who demonstrated exceptional courage or discipline. They were gatekeepers, testing the worthiness of those who sought to pass from the lowlands into the high country, from the mundane world into the realm of the sacred. And they were, above all, unpredictable. To encounter a Tengu was to step outside the predictable order of cause and effect, to enter a space where intention and outcome no longer aligned, where the rules you had lived by no longer held. The geography of Tengu belief was coextensive with the geography of Buddhist practice. By the late Heian period, the mountains of Japan had become sites of intense religious activity. The Tendai and Shingon sects, both esoteric branches of Buddhism imported from China, placed great emphasis on mountain asceticism as a path to enlightenment. Monks would retreat to the high country for months or years at a time, engaging in practices that pushed the body to its limits: fasting, meditation in freezing waterfalls, circumambulating sacred peaks in the dead of winter. These practices were believed to burn away the impurities of the self, to strip the mind of its attachments and illusions, and to bring the practitioner into direct contact with the numinous. But the mountains were also dangerous. Exposure, starvation, falls, and animal attacks claimed the lives of countless ascetics, and, in the Buddhist worldview, they were the personifications of the mountain's hostility, the intelligences that inhabited the space between life and death, enlightenment and damnation. They were the doubts that crept into the mind during the third day of a fast. They were the voices that whispered in the ear during meditation, offering shortcuts, forbidden knowledge, the promise of power without the burden of discipline. They were the tests that the mountain itself imposed, and passing those tests required not just physical endurance, but spiritual clarity. To mistake a Tengu for a god was to invite disaster. To dismiss them as mere demons was to miss the lesson they offered. By the medieval period, two distinct types of Tengu had emerged in the popular imagination, each with its own iconography and mythological role. The first, the Daitengu, Great Tengu, were humanoid figures, with long noses, red faces, and the bearing of aristocrats, or high Jan-ranking monks. They carried feather fans made from the tail plumes of raptors, and wore the robes of Buddhist clergy, or the armor of samurai. They were leaders, strategists, and masters of martial arts. capable of teaching swordsmanship to humans who proved themselves worthy. The most famous of these was Fei of Mount Kurama, who, according to legend, trained the young warrior Minamoto no Yoshitsune in the art of combat. Yoshitsune would go on to become one of the greatest generals of the Genpei War, Itenyi by Basha Fei, Itenyi by Basha Wu, and his victories were attributed, in part, to the supernatural skill imparted by his Tengu master. The second type, the Konoha Zen Tengu, Crow Tengu, were smaller, more avian in appearance. They had the bodies of birds, usually crows or kites, and the ability to fly at incredible speeds. They were the messengers and scouts of the Tengu hierarchy, less powerful than the Dai Tengu, but more numerous and more likely to be encountered by ordinary people. In No theater, Konoha Gen Tengu were represented by masks with short beaks and expressions of manic glee, and they often appeared in plays as tricksters who disrupted human affairs before being driven away by the intervention of a deity or a virtuous hero. But this division was never absolute. The Tengu were shaped Zen shifters by nature, and their forms were fluid, contingent on the needs of the story and the perspective of the observer. A monk who encountered a Tengu in the forest might describe it as a towering figure with wings and a face like polished bronze. A peasant might report seeing a man in monk's robes who vanished when approached. A child might claim to have heard laughter in the trees and seen nothing at all. They were manifestations of the mountain's intelligence, and they appeared in whatever guise the mountain required. The legend of Minamoto no Yoshitsune and Fei, recorded in the Jaikiki, a 14th Gen century chronicle of Yoshitsune's life, is the most famous Tengu narrative in Japanese culture. According to the tale, Yoshitsune was born Ushiwakamaru, the 9th son of Minamoto no Yoshitomo, a warrior who was killed in a failed coup against the Taira clan. Orphaned at the age of 2, Ushiwakamaru was sent to Kurama Temple, a Tendai monastery on the slopes of Mount Kurama, where he was to be trained as a monk. But the boy had no interest in monastic life. He spent his days wandering the forest, practicing swordplay with a wooden stick, and dreaming of avenging his father's death. One night, while training alone on a mountain trail, he was confronted by a figure of immense stature, a man with a red face, a nose like a tengu's, and eyes that glowed with an inner fire. This was Fei, the king of the Tengu of Mount Kurama. Fei recognized in Ushiwakamaru a warrior's spirit, a determination that could not be extinguished by monastic discipline. He offered to teach the boy the secret arts of combat, not just the techniques of the sword, but the deeper principles of strategy, timing, and the manipulation of an opponent's mind. For years, Ushiwakamaru trained under Fei's tutelage, learning to move with the speed of a striking falcon, to anticipate an enemy's attack before the blade left the scabbard, to fight with a calm, focused mind that was immune to fear or rage. When he left Mount Kurama at the age of 15, he had become Minamoto no Yoshitsune, and the skills he had learned from the Tengu king made him nearly invincible on the battlefield. But the story did not end in triumph. Yoshitsune's military genius brought him into conflict with his older brother, Minamoto no Yoritomo, who saw him as a threat to his own power. Yoshitsune was forced to flee, hunted across Japan by the very forces he had once led. He died at the age of 30, cornered in a remote stronghold, taking his own life rather than surrendering to his brother's soldiers. The legend of Fei's training became, in retrospect, a kind of curse. The Tengu had given Yoshitsune the power to win any battle, but they had not given him the wisdom to navigate the politics of peace. He had been made into a perfect weapon, and weapons in the end are always discarded. This theme, the Tengu as teachers who impart dangerous gifts, runs through much of Japanese folklore. They were not benevolent mentors. They were immoral forces, interested in the exercise of their own power and the perpetuation of their own strange codes of honor. To seek their instruction was to gamble with fate, to trade one kind of vulnerability for another. The samurai who learned swordsmanship from a Tengu might become unbeatable in combat, but he would also become isolated, unable to return to the world of ordinary human relationships. The monk who sought enlightenment through Tengu teachings might gain supernatural insight, but he would also risk losing his sanity, his sense of self, his connection to the Buddha's compassion. The Yamabushi, the mountain ascetics who practiced Shugen-fei, a syncretic tradition that blended esoteric Buddhism, Shinto animism, and Taoist alchemy, occupied a particularly ambiguous space in relation to the Tengu. The Yamabushi, dressed in white robes and small black caps, carried staffs and conch gen shell horns, and performed rituals that were said to grant them supernatural powers. The ability to walk on coals, to exorcise demons, to predict the future, to communicate with the dead. They lived in the same high-den altitude forests where the Tengu were said to dwell, and their practices, fasting meditation, exposure to extreme cold, mirrored the ordeals that Tengu were believed to impose on intruders in their territory. Over time, the line between Yamabushi and Tengu began to blur. Some folktales described Yamabushi, who had trained for so long in the mountains that they had transformed into Tengu themselves, their humanity burned away by the rigors of ascetic practice. Others suggested that the Tengu were, in fact, the spirits of dead Yamabushi, monks who had failed to achieve enlightenment and become trapped in a liminal state, neither human nor divine. This conflation was not merely a matter of folklore. It had political and social consequences. By the Muromachi period, 1536-1570，the Yamabushi had become a significant military and economic force. They controlled the pilgrimage routes to sacred mountains, operated as mercenaries in regional conflicts, and maintained alliances with both Buddhist temples and local warlords. They were feared for their supposed supernatural abilities and respected for their martial prowess, but they were also seen as threats to centralized authority, as representatives of a wild, unregulated spirituality that could not be easily opted by the state. The association between Yamabushi and Tengu, both marginal, both dangerous, both operating outside the structures of settled society, served to further alienate them from mainstream Japanese culture. To call a Yamabushi a Tengu was to suggest that he had abandoned his humanity, that he was no longer bound by the moral and social codes that governed ordinary people. During the Edo period, 1666-1567, under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, the government took active steps to suppress the Yamabushi and to regulate the practice of Shugen-fei. Laws were passed restricting mountain pilgrimage, requiring ascetics to register with temples, and prohibiting unauthorized rituals. The official justification was that these practices were heretical, that they deviated from orthodox Buddhist doctrine, but the underlying concern was political. The Yamabushi represented a form of spiritual and martial power that existed outside the shogunate's control, and the Tengu mythology that surrounded them made them seem even more threatening. If people believed that Yamabushi could become Tengu, if they believed that the mountains harbored beings with supernatural abilities and no loyalty to human rulers, then the mountains themselves became sites of resistance, spaces where the authority of the state could be challenged or ignored. The Tengu mythology adapted to these pressures. In popular literature and theater of the Edo period, Tengu were increasingly depicted as cautionary figures, symbols of spiritual pride and moral failure. In Buddhist sermons and didactic texts, they were presented as demons who preyed on monks who had become too attached to their own learning, who had mistaken intellectual achievement for enlightenment. One famous story, recorded in the Tengu Zedfeishi, a satirical scroll from the late Kamakura period, Iten Yibai Basha Wu, Fei Iten Senbai Senshasen, depicted various sects of Buddhism as being overrun with Tengu, hypocritical monks who had fallen into arrogance and were now tormented by the very demons they had become. The scroll was a critique of ecclesiastical corruption, but it also reinforced the idea that Tengu were, at their core, reflections of human vice. They were not external threats, but internal failings, the dark side of spiritual ambition. Yet even as the Tengu were being reframed as moral warnings, they retained their earlier associations with wildness, with the untamable forces of nature, with the mountain's refusal to be domesticated. In rural areas, shrines dedicated to Tengu continue to operate, often in defiance of official disapproval. Farmers and loggers left offerings at these shrines, not because they worshipped the Tengu as gods, but because they recognized them as powers that could not be ignored. The Tengu were the spirits of the forest, the intelligences that decided whether a tree would fall safely or crush the man who felled it, whether a trail would remain passable or collapse into a ravine. To ignore them was to invite disaster. To honor them was not an act of devotion, but a form of negotiation, a pragmatic acknowledgement of forces beyond human control. This duality, Tengu as moral symbols and Tengu as ecological forces, has persisted into the modern era. In contemporary Japan, Tengu are simultaneously figures of folklore and symbols of environmental consciousness. They appear in political discourse as metaphors for the dangers of unchecked development, the arrogance of assuming that human technology can conquer or replace the natural world. They appear in video games and anime as ancient, powerful beings who serve as allies or antagonists depending on the protagonist's actions. And they appear, still, in the rural shrines and mountain trails where their worship has never fully ceased, where the old logic that the mountain is alive, that it watches, that it must be respected, remains operative. The Tengu are creatures of red faces and long noses, of wings and talons and mocking laughter. But they are also, and perhaps more fundamentally, creatures of threshold. They are the intelligences that inhabit the space between the human and the divine, the civilized and the wild, the known and the unknowable. They are the mountain's response to those who would climb it, the forest's test for those who would enter it, the air's resistance to those who would breathe it. They are what the world becomes when you leave the valley behind and ascend into the thin, cold places where the rules of ordinary life no longer apply. And they are, perhaps, what we become when we spend too long in those places, when we forget the names of the people we left behind, when we stop speaking in words and start speaking in wind, when we realize that the laughter we hear in the trees is our own. The appearance of the Tengu varies widely depending on the source, the region, and the period. But certain core features remain constant across the centuries. The Tengu, the greater Tengu, are almost always depicted as humanoid figures of imposing stature, ranging from 6 to 8 feet in height. Their skin is red, not the red of sunburn or exertion, but a deep arterial crimson, the color of rage or fire. Their faces are dominated by long, prominent noses, often described as being several inches in length, and their eyes are frequently depicted as glowing, either with a golden light or a pale, ghostly luminescence. They wear robes that resemble those of Buddhist monks, but these robes are often tattered or stained, suggesting a rejection of monastic discipline. Or they wear the armor of samurai, complete with swords and other weapons. They carry fans made from feathers, usually from the tails of hawks or eagles, and these fans are said to possess supernatural properties. They can summon winds strong enough to level forests, create illusions, or knock a man unconscious from 100 yards away. The Konoha-jan Tengu, the lesser Tengu, are more avian in appearance. They have the bodies of large birds, most commonly crows or black kites, with wingspans that can reach 6 feet or more. Their faces, however, retain a disturbing human quality. Eyes that are too intelligent, expressions that suggest mockery or malice. In some accounts, they are capable of assuming fully human form for short periods. But their disguises are always imperfect. They might forget to hide their talons, or their voices might carry an avian rasp, or their shadows might reveal wings, even when their bodies do not. They are faster and more agile than the Tengu, capable of moving through the forest canopy at speeds that make them nearly impossible to track. And they are said to communicate with each other through a language of clicks and whistles that sounds almost like bird calls, but contains a syntactic complexity that no natural bird could produce. Both types of Tengu are said to possess the ability to fly, though the mechanics of this flight are rarely described in detail. Some accounts suggest that they use their wings in a conventional manner, generating lift through rapid flapping. Others claim that their flight is more supernatural, a form of levitation or teleportation that allows them to move from one point to another without traversing the space in between. A monk traveling from Kyoto to Edo might fall asleep under a tree on Mount Kurama and wake up hours later on a peak in the Japanese Alps, with no memory of how he got there, and only the faint impression of having been carried through the air by something with feathers and claws. The Tengu are also shape-jan shifters, though their transformations are rarely perfect. A Tengu might assume the form of a beautiful woman to seduce a monk, but her laughter will be too sharp, her movements too quick, her eyes too knowing. A Tengu might disguise itself as a fellow traveler on a mountain path, but it will speak in riddles, and its footsteps will make no sound on the gravel. A Tengu might appear as a child in distress, crying for help at the edge of a cliff. But anyone who approaches too closely will find that the child has no shadow, or that its breath does not mist in the cold air, or that its skin is just a shade too red to be entirely human. The Tengu are said to possess a range of supernatural abilities beyond flight and shape-and shifting. They can control the weather, summoning storms or dispelling them at will. They can create illusions so convincing that entire armies have been known to march off cliffs, mistaking thin air for solid ground. They can read minds, anticipating an opponent's moves in combat before the thought has fully formed. They can possess human beings, driving them to madness, or compelling them to commit acts of violence or self-destruction. And they can manipulate time, causing travelers to lose days or weeks in what feels like a single afternoon, or compressing years of experience into a single night. But the Tengu are not invincible. They have weaknesses. Though these weaknesses are rarely straightforward, iron is said to repel them, or at least to cause them discomfort, which is why Yamabushi often carried iron staffs or wore iron rings. Buddhist mantras, when chanted with sufficient focus and purity of intent, can banish them or render their illusions ineffective. Acts of genuine humility, admitting ignorance, showing respect for the mountain, making offerings without expectation of reward, can sometimes win their favor, or at least prevent them from causing harm. But pride, arrogance, or any display of spiritual complacency is almost guaranteed to provoke their wrath. A monk who boasts of his learning will find himself lost in the forest for days, stumbling in circles until he collapses from exhaustion. A samurai who claims to be unbeatable in combat will be challenged by a Tengu and defeated, not through superior skill but through psychological manipulation, through the exploitation of his own overconfidence. The Tengu are also said to be bound by certain rules or codes of honor, though these codes are not human and can seem arbitrary or cruel from a human perspective. They do not kill without reason, but their definition of reason is broad and often inscrutable. A Tengu might kill a traveler who cuts down a sacred tree, or who fails to bow at a mountain shrine, or who speaks disrespectfully of the spirits. But a Tengu might also spare someone who has committed a far greater offense, simply because that person demonstrated courage or honesty in the face of death. The Tengu are not interested in justice as humans understand it. They are interested in testing, in revealing character, in forcing people to confront the limits of their own understanding. Different regions of Japan have different Tengu traditions, reflecting local variations in geography, culture, and religious practice. In the mountains of Shikoku, Tengu are sometimes described as guardians of pilgrimage routes, spirits that watch over the travelers on the 80-8 temple pilgrimage and punish those who undertake the journey for impure reasons. Vanity, tourism, the desire for social status, rather than genuine spiritual seeking. In the mountains of northern Honshu, Tengu are associated with the Ainu, the indigenous people of Japan, and are sometimes described as wearing Ainu clothing or speaking in the Ainu language, a detail that suggests a deep historical connection between Tengu mythology and the cultural memory of contact between Japanese settlers and the indigenous populations they displaced. On Mount Takao, near Tokyo, the Tengu tradition remains vibrant even today. The mountain is home to the Yakufein Temple, a Shingon Buddhist monastery that has served as a center of Tengu worship for over 1,000 years. The temple grounds are filled with statues and carvings of Tengu, and pilgrims leave offerings of sake, rice, and feathers at shrines dedicated to these beings. The Tengu of Mount Takao are believed to be protectors of the forest, enforcers of ecological balance, and teachers of martial arts. Local tradition holds that many of the greatest swordsmen of the Edo period came to Mount Takao to train, and that those who persevered in their training would sometimes be visited by a Tengu, who would correct their form, challenge them to duels, or simply observe in silence. A silent validation of their dedication. In the Kumano region, on the Kii Peninsula, Tengu are closely associated with the Kumano Cod Fae, a network of ancient pilgrimage trails that wind through the mountains and link the three grand shrines of Kumano. The trails are steep, narrow, and treacherous, passing through dense cedar forests and across rivers that swell with snowmelt in the spring. Pilgrims who travel these routes often report strange experiences: missing time, disorientation, the sensation of being watched, voices calling their names from the forest when no one is there. These experiences are attributed to the Tengu, who are said to test the resolve of pilgrims and to punish those who show disrespect to the sacred landscape. The Tengu are also said to have a hierarchy, a social structure that mirrors the hierarchies of Buddhist monasteries and samurai clans. At the top is Fei, the king of the Tengu, who resides on Mount Kurama, and who has ruled over the Tengu for centuries, perhaps millennia. Below him are regional lords, Tengu who control specific mountains or forests, and who command their own retinues of lesser Tengu. These regional lords are often named in local folklore: Negu of Mount Takao, Ta Fei of Mount Otago, Jir Fei of Mount Hiko, and they are the beings most likely to be encountered by humans, since they patrol the borders of their territories and respond to intrusions. Below the regional lords are the Konoha Gen Tengu, the rank and file, the messengers and scouts and enforcers who carry out the will of their superiors. This hierarchy is not rigid, and it is possible for a Tengu to rise or fall in rank, depending on its actions. A Konoha Gen Tengu who demonstrates exceptional skill or cunning might be promoted to the status of Daitengu. A Daitengu who fails in its duties or who is defeated in combat by a human might be demoted or expelled from the hierarchy entirely, forced to wander as a ronin, a masterless Tengu, until it can redeem itself. The Tengu are, in this sense, a mirror of the samurai class during the feudal period, bound by codes of honor, organized into hierarchies, obsessed with rank and reputation, and willing to go to extraordinary lengths to preserve or restore their status. The origin of Tengu transformation, how a being becomes a Tengu, or what circumstances summon a Tengu into existence, has been a subject of debate within Japanese Buddhism for centuries. The earliest Buddhist interpretations, dating from the Heian period, framed Tengu as the spirits of monks who had failed to achieve enlightenment due to pride or arrogance. These monks, having devoted their lives to study and practice, accumulated vast knowledge of Buddhist doctrine and ritual, but they mistook intellectual mastery for spiritual liberation. They became attached to their own learning, proud of their abilities, and contemptuous of those who had not achieved their level of understanding. When they died, their karma, the accumulated weight of their pride and attachment, prevented them from being reborn in a higher realm or achieving nirvana. Instead, they were reborn as Tengu, condemned to dwell in the mountains, forever seeking the enlightenment they had once believed they possessed but never truly understood. This interpretation was not merely theological speculation. It was a warning embedded in the structure of monastic life. The pursuit of enlightenment, according to Buddhist doctrine, required the cultivation of humility, compassion, and attachment. But the monastic system itself, with its hierarchies, its emphasis on textual mastery, its competition for patronage and prestige, created conditions that encouraged exactly the opposite. Monks competed to become the most learned, the most accomplished in ritual, the most eloquent in debate. They accumulated titles and honors. They wrote commentaries on commentaries, each one more elaborate than the last, and in doing so, they risked falling into the trap that the Tengu represented, the trap of believing that spiritual progress could be measured in external achievements, that enlightenment was a prize to be won rather than a state to be realized. The Tengu Zitfeishi, the satirical scroll mentioned earlier, made this critique explicit. The scroll depicted the Tengu as former monks from various Buddhist sects, each one trapped in a form that reflected the specific nature of his pride. A monk who had been obsessed with ritual purity was shown as a Tengu with an absurdly long nose, symbolizing his inflated sense of self-gen importance. A monk who had been consumed by doctrinal disputes was depicted with multiple heads, each one arguing with the others, unable to achieve the unity of mind that enlightenment required. The scroll was humorous, but it was also deeply serious. It suggested that the Tengu were not external demons, but internal ones, the shadow side of the spiritual life, the inevitable consequence of pursuing enlightenment for the wrong reasons. But there were other origin stories, ones that did not frame the Tengu as failed humans, but as primordial beings, spirits of the mountain that had existed long before Buddhism arrived in Japan. In Shinto cosmology, mountains were believed to be the dwelling places of kami, the spirits or gods that animated the natural world. These kami were not moral beings in the Christian sense. They were forces of nature, expressions of the mountain's will, and they operated according to their own logic. They could be benevolent or malevolent, generous or wrathful, depending on how they were treated. The Tengu, in this framework, was simply one type of mountain kami, beings that embodied the mountain's wildness, its resistance to human intrusion, its refusal to be fully known or controlled. This interpretation aligned more closely with the practices of the Yamabushi, who saw the mountains as living entities, as teachers that could impart wisdom to those who approached them with the proper reverence. For the Yamabushi, the Tengu were not demons to be exorcised, but powers to be negotiated with. Intelligences that could grant knowledge or bestow abilities if approached in the right way. A Yamabushi who spent years training in the mountains might, if he persevered, encounter a Tengu and receive instruction in secret techniques. Not just martial skills, but also forms of healing, divination, and spiritual protection. These techniques were passed down through oral tradition, never written down, and they formed the core of Shugen Fei practice. The line between becoming a Tengu and learning from a Tengu was often blurred in these traditions. Some accounts described Yamabushi who had trained so intensely, and for so long, that they began to exhibit Tengu Jan-like traits. The ability to move through the forest without making a sound, to survive for weeks without food, to see in the dark, to sense the presence of spirits. Were these men becoming Tengu, or were they simply mastering abilities that the Tengu had always possessed? The question had no clear answer, and perhaps that was the point. The Tengu represented a threshold, a boundary between human and non-Zen human, and those who crossed that boundary, whether through spiritual transformation, physical ordeal, or both, became something other than what they had been. There were also stories of Tengu being created through acts of violence or injustice. A samurai who died in battle without achieving his goals might become a Tengu, his rage and frustration preventing him from moving on to the next life. A lord who was overthrown and executed might transform into a Tengu, his spirit haunting the mountains near his former domain, seeking revenge on those who had betrayed him. These transformation narratives were common in the Sengoku period, an era of near-Zen constant warfare, when the social order had collapsed and death was a daily occurrence. The Tengu of this period were often depicted as vengeful, violent beings, reflections of the chaos and brutality of the age. But regardless of their origin, all Tengu shared certain characteristics. They were liminal beings, existing between categories. They were associated with mountains and forests, with places beyond the reach of human authority, and they were, above all, dangerous. To encounter a Tengu was to step outside the safety of the known world, to enter a space where the rules of human society no longer applied, and where the only law was the mountain's law, inscrutable, unforgiving, and absolute. The transformation of Tengu from indigenous Japanese spirits into figures that could be interpreted, categorized, and explained by outsiders began in earnest during the Meiji era, when Japan ended its policy of national isolation and opened itself to Western influence. For the first time, European and American scholars, missionaries, and travelers gained sustained access to Japanese culture, and they brought with them the intellectual frameworks of 19th century anthropology, comparative religion, and folkloristics. The Tengu, like many other aspects of Japanese folklore, were subjected to this external gaze, and the result was a series of interpretations that often revealed more about the interpreters than about the Tengu themselves. One of the earliest Western discussions of Tengu appeared in the work of Basil Hall Chamberlain, a British scholar who spent much of his career in Japan, and who published Things Japanese, a comprehensive guide to Japanese culture. In Itenbabai Josh, Chamberlain described the Tengu as goblin-den-like beings associated with mountains and forests, and he noted their role in Buddhist morality tales, as symbols of spiritual pride. But he also interpreted them through the lens of European demonology, comparing them to Christian devils, and suggesting that their long noses and red faces were evidence of a universal human tendency to personify evil in grotesque, exaggerated forms. This comparison, while superficially plausible, flattened the Tengu into a familiar category, demons, and stripped them of their specifically Japanese context, their connection to mountain asceticism, their role as teachers and tricksters, their ambiguous moral status. Chamberlain was not alone in this approach. Lafcadio Hearn, an Irish Gen Greek writer who moved to Japan in Iten Babajosha and became one of the most influential Western interpreters of Japanese culture, also wrote extensively about Tengu, and his accounts were similarly shaped by Western assumptions. In his collection Kwaiden, Stories and Studies of Strange Things, published in Itenjobarin C, Hearn presented Tengu as supernatural beings that existed somewhere between ghosts and gods, capable of both malevolence and benevolence, but ultimately incomprehensible to the rational Western mind. Hearn's writing was lyrical and evocative, and it helped to popularize Japanese folklore in the English-speaking world. But it also exoticized the Tengu, framing them as representatives of a mystical, inscrutable East that could never be fully understood by Western logic. These early Western interpretations had consequences beyond the realm of literature. They influenced how Japanese folklore was studied and categorized in academic contexts. And they shaped the expectations of tourists and travelers who visited Japan in the early 20th century. The Tengu became part of a broader narrative about Japanese culture as ancient, spiritual, and fundamentally different from the modern, rational West. This narrative was not entirely inaccurate. There were, and are, real differences in how Japanese and Western cultures approach questions of spirituality, nature, and the supernatural. But it was reductive. It turned the Tengu into cultural artifacts, objects to be observed and studied, rather than living elements of a religious and philosophical tradition that continued to evolve. The most significant external engagement with Tengu mythology, however, came not from scholars but from the Japanese government itself, which, during the Meiji era, undertook a systematic effort to modernize and rationalize Japanese culture. This effort included the suppression of Shugen-fei, the mountain ascetic tradition most closely associated with Tengu worship. In Itenbabaitsi-shara, the Meiji government issued an edict that effectively banned Shugen-fei, forcing Yamabushi to either join mainstream Buddhist sects or abandon their practices entirely. The official justification was that Shugen-fei was a corrupt, syncretic tradition that mixed Buddhism and Shinto in ways that were doctrinally unsound. But the underlying motivation was political. The Yamabushi, with their independence, their supernatural reputations, and their connections to rural populations, represented a form of spiritual authority that existed outside the control of the centralized state. By suppressing Shugen-fei, the government was also suppressing the Tengu mythology that sustained it. The impact of this suppression was profound. Shrines dedicated to Tengu were closed or converted to mainstream Shinto use. Pilgrimage routes that had been maintained by Yamabushi for centuries fell into disrepair. Oral traditions that had been passed down through generations of mountain ascetics were lost as the communities that preserved them disbanded. By the early 20th century, the Tengu had been largely relegated to the realm of folklore. Stories told to children, motifs used in art and theater, but no longer active participants in a living religious tradition. Yet the Tengu did not disappear. They survived. In part, because the mountains themselves survived, because the forests remained, because the need to negotiate with the wild, untamable aspects of the natural world did not go away simply because the government had issued an edict. Rural communities continued to leave offerings at Tengu shrines, even if those shrines were officially dedicated to other deities. Loggers and hunters continued to tell stories about encounters with Tengu, and these stories were passed down to their children and grandchildren, becoming part of a vernacular tradition that existed parallel to, and sometimes in defiance of, official culture. The Tengu also survived because they were adaptable. As Japan modernized, the Tengu mythology adapted to new contexts. During the militaristic period of the Itenjobai Senshimas and early Itenjobai Sishimaut, Tengu were sometimes invoked as symbols of Japanese martial spirit, as embodiments of the warrior ethos that the government sought to cultivate. This use of Tengu imagery was selective and propagandistic, stripping away the ambiguity and moral complexity of the original stories, and replacing them with a simplified narrative of strength and discipline. But it kept the Tengu in the public consciousness, and when the war ended and Japan entered a new phase of cultural transformation, the Tengu were available to be reinterpreted once again. In the post-war period, Western anthropologists and folklorists returned to the study of Tengu with new methodologies and perspectives. Carmen Blacker, a British scholar of Japanese religion, published The Catalpa, a study of shamanistic practices in Japan in Itsenjōbaitsi Shawu, which included extensive discussions of Tengu and their role in Shugenfei. Blacker's work was notable for its attempt to understand Tengu on their own terms, as elements of a coherent religious system rather than as curiosities or superstitions. She documented the rituals, beliefs, and practices of Yamabushi communities that had survived the Meiji suppression. And she argued that the Tengu mythology was deeply intertwined with practices of mediation between human and spirit worlds, between the village and the mountain, between the known and the unknown. Blacker's work, along with that of other scholars such as H. Byron Earhart and Miyake Hitoshi, helped to shift the academic study of Tengu away from the exoticizing frameworks of the 19th century, and toward a more nuanced understanding of their role in Japanese religious life. These scholars emphasized that the Tengu were not static symbols, but dynamic figures whose meanings changed depending on context, audience, and historical moment. The Tengu that a Heian-jan period monk encountered in a Buddhist morality tale was not the same Tengu that a Meiji-jan era farmer left offerings for, and neither was the same as the Tengu that appeared in post-war anime or manga. But all of these Tengu shared a common origin, a connection to the mountains and the wild spaces that humans could enter but never fully control. The documented encounters with Tengu, or with phenomena attributed to Tengu, span more than 1,000 years of Japanese history, and they range from the poetic and allegorical to the disturbingly specific. These accounts are not, in most cases, direct evidence of the existence of Tengu as physical beings, but they are evidence of something, of a cultural belief so pervasive and so enduring that it shaped how people interpreted ambiguous experiences, how they made sense of the strange and the inexplicable, and how they transmitted those interpretations across generations. One of the earliest documented Tengu encounters appears in the Konjaku Monogatari, the collection of Buddhist tales compiled in the early 12th century. The story concerns a monk named Kei-Fei, who was traveling through the mountains of Yamashiro province, in modern Jandei Kyoto prefecture, when he encountered a figure that he initially mistook for a fellow monk. The figure was tall, dressed in tattered robes, and carried a staff. But as Kei-Fei approached, he noticed that the figure's face was red, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The figure spoke to Kei-Fei in a voice that sounded like wind through bamboo, asking him questions about his understanding of Buddhist doctrine. Kei-Fei, proud of his learning, answered at length, quoting sutras and elaborating on points of doctrinal interpretation. The figure listened in silence, and when Kei-Fei had finished, it began to laugh, a high, mocking sound that echoed through the forest. The figure then revealed itself as a Tengu and told Kei-Fei that his learning was worthless, that he had mistaken memorization for understanding, and that he would never achieve enlightenment if he continued to rely on intellectual pride. The Tengu then vanished, and Kei-Fei was left alone on the mountain path, disoriented and shaken. He returned to his monastery, and according to the text, spent the rest of his life in silent meditation, speaking only when necessary and never again boasting of his knowledge. This story is clearly didactic, designed to reinforce Buddhist teachings about the dangers of pride and the limits of intellectual knowledge. But it also contains specific details: the mountain location, the appearance of the Tengu, the nature of the encounter, that suggest it may have been based on a real experience, or at least on a template of real experiences that monks in the mountains reported. The phenomenon of disorientation in the mountains, the sense of being watched or followed, the auditory hallucinations that can occur during periods of extreme fatigue or fasting, all of these could be interpreted within the framework of Buddhist cosmology as encounters with Tengu. A more dramatic account comes from the Muromachi period, recorded in the Taihaki, a historical chronicle compiled in the late 14th century. The account describes an incident that occurred in Iten Senbai Senshiba during the wars between the northern and southern courts, when a samurai named Kusunoki Masatsura was leading his forces through the mountains of Kawachi province. According to the chronicle, Masatsura and his men encountered a violent storm that seemed to come from nowhere, winds strong enough to uproot trees, lightning that struck without thunder, rain that fell horizontally. The storm lasted for hours, and when it finally cleared, the army found that they had been turned around, that they were no longer on the path they had been following, but were instead deep in unfamiliar territory. Scouts sent to reconnoiter reported seeing figures in the trees, humanoid shapes with wings. But when they approached, the figures vanished. Masatsura interpreted the storm and the figures as the work of Tengu, spirits that were either protecting the territory or punishing the army for some transgression. He ordered his men to make offerings at a nearby mountain shrine, and they were able to find their way back to the main road without further incident. This account is interesting because it does not frame the Tengu as malevolent. The storm and the disorientation were interpreted as tests or warnings, not as attacks. The fact that the army was able to continue, once they had made the appropriate offerings, suggests that the Tengu were acting as gatekeepers, enforcing a protocol that required acknowledgement of their presence and respect for the territory they controlled. This interpretation is consistent with the broader Tengu mythology, which emphasizes that these beings are not inherently hostile, but are responsive to how they are treated. The Edo period, with its relative political stability and its flourishing print culture, produced a wealth of Tengu accounts, many of them published in popular collections of strange tales and supernatural encounters. One such collection, the Ihon Hyaku Monogatari, picture book of 100 tales, compiled by Takara Shunch-Feisai in Itenbabai Sishii, includes an account of a woodcutter named Jensfei, who claimed to have been abducted by Tengu in Itenbabai Ashasen. According to Jensfei's testimony, which was recorded by a local magistrate, he was working in a forest on the slopes of Mount Ontake when he heard a sound like the beating of enormous wings. He looked up and saw a figure descending from the trees, a man with red skin, a long nose, and eyes that glowed like embers. The figure grabbed Jensfei by the shoulders and lifted him into the air. Jensfei lost consciousness and woke up hours later on a different mountain more than 30 miles from where he had been. When he returned to his village and reported what had happened, he was examined by a physician who found bruises on his shoulders consistent with being gripped by large hands and scratches on his back that looked as though they had been made by talons. The magistrate's report, preserved in the archives of Nagano Prefecture, treats Jensfei's account with a degree of skepticism, but does not dismiss it outright. The magistrate notes that Jensfei had no reason to fabricate the story. He was a well-regarded member of his community, with no history of dishonesty or mental illness, and that the physical evidence supported at least some of his claims. The report concludes by suggesting that Jensfei may have encountered a Yamabushi who was performing rituals in the forest and who used some form of drug or hypnosis to disorient him. But it also acknowledges the possibility that he had encountered a genuine Tengu. The ambiguity is characteristic of Edo Zen period attitudes toward the supernatural. These were not matters that could be resolved through empirical investigation, and the most prudent response was to acknowledge the limits of human knowledge. Another well-documented case, this one from the late Edo period, involves a series of disappearances in the mountains near Nikfei, in what is now Tochigi Prefecture, between Itenbabai Wushisi and Itenbabai Wushiliu. At least 7 travelers, pilgrims, merchants, and Yamabushi search parties found no bodies, no signs of violence, and no indication of where the missing people had gone. Local residents attributed the disappearances to Tengu, and offerings were made at shrines throughout the region in an attempt to appease them. The disappearances stopped in Itenbabai Wushitsi as abruptly as they had begun, and no satisfactory explanation was ever found. Modern historians have speculated that the disappearances may have been the result of banditry, or of travelers falling into ravines, or being buried by avalanches. But the fact remains that no physical evidence was ever recovered, and the Tengu explanation persisted in local oral tradition well into the 20th century. The Meiji era brought a new form of documentation. The modernization of Japan included the establishment of a national press, and newspapers began to report on local incidents with a level of detail, and one such report, published in the Yomiuri Shimbun on August Shuwu, Itenbabai Bashijo, described an incident in which a group of school children on a hiking trip in the mountains near Nagano reported seeing a large bird Zen-like creature with a human face. The children described the creature as being approximately 6 feet tall, with wings that spanned 12 feet or more, and they claimed that it had followed them for several miles before disappearing into the forest. The report was accompanied by an editorial note expressing skepticism about the children's account, suggesting that they had likely seen a large eagle or hawk and had allowed their imaginations to transform it into something more fantastical. But the fact that the report was published at all indicates that Tengu sightings were still considered newsworthy, still part of the cultural conversation, even in an era that prided itself on rationality and scientific progress. The most famous 20th century Tengu case, or at least the one that has received the most attention from Western researchers, occurred in Itenjōbai-wushira, in the mountains of Yamagata Prefecture. A group of hikers exploring a remote area of the Feiyu Mountains reported finding a series of large footprints in the snow, each one approximately 18 inches long and shaped like a human foot, but with elongated toes that ended in what appeared to be talons. The footprints were photographed and measured, and they were later examined by zoologists at Tafehoku University, who could not identify them as belonging to any known animal species. The prevailing theory was that they were hoaxes, created by someone with a carved wooden foot. But no one came forward to claim responsibility, and the photographs remain unexplained. The hikers who found the footprints reported that they also heard strange sounds while in the area, whistles and clicks that did not match the calls of any local bird species, and what they described as laughter, high-pitched and mocking, coming from the trees. They did not see any creature, but they felt watched, and they left the area as quickly as possible. One member of the group, a man named Sat-Fei Kenji, later wrote an account of the experience for a local magazine, in which he stated that he was convinced they had encountered evidence of Tengu. Sat-Fei's account was widely dismissed as sensationalism, but it was also widely read, and it contributed to a resurgence of interest in Tengu folklore during the Itenjōbai-wushima and Itenjōbai-ryōshima, a period when many Japanese people were grappling with questions about tradition, modernity, and the loss of connection to rural and mountain landscapes. These documented cases do not prove the existence of Tengu as physical entities, but they demonstrate the persistence of Tengu belief across centuries and across different types of evidence: textual, legal, journalistic, photographic. They show that the Tengu were not merely literary figures or religious symbols, but were part of the lived experience of people who traveled through the mountains, who worked in the forests, who encountered things they could not explain, and who reached for the Tengu mythology as a way of making sense of those encounters. Whether the Tengu were real in a literal sense is perhaps less important than the fact that they were real in a cultural sense, that they shaped how people understood the world and their place in it. The Tengu entered popular culture in the modern sense during the early 20th century, as Japan underwent rapid industrialization and urbanization, and as traditional folk narratives began to be adapted for new media. The first significant Tengu representation in modern literature appeared in the works of Akutagawa Rai Funosuke, one of Japan's most celebrated short story writers. In his Itenjōbai Ashitsu Tori Kappa, Akutagawa used the Tengu, not as central characters, but as references within a broader satirical exploration of Japanese society. The Kappa, another creature from Japanese folklore, interacts with a society that includes Tengu, Gen-like figures, representing the arrogance of the intellectual class. Akutagawa's treatment was allegorical rather than literal, but it established a pattern that would persist: the Tengu as symbols of pride, hypocrisy, and the dangers of intellectual or spiritual pretension. The post-Gen World War II era saw a proliferation of Tengu imagery in Japanese cinema. One of the earliest and most influential films was Ugetsu Monogatari Tales of Ugetsu, directed by Mizoguchi Kenji, and released in Itenjōbai-wushisen. While the film does not feature Tengu as primary characters, it draws heavily on the aesthetic and thematic traditions of Japanese ghost stories and folklore, including the motif of mountain spirits that punish human arrogance. The film's treatment of the supernatural as something beautiful, dangerous, and deeply intertwined with the moral failings of its human characters reflected the traditional Tengu mythology, even when Tengu themselves were not explicitly depicted. A more direct representation appeared in the Itenjōbai-wushijo film Wai Feikai Hayaku Monogatari, 100 Ghost Stories, directed by Nakagawa Nobu, which included a sequence featuring a Tengu as a vengeful spirit that terrorizes a corrupt official. The Tengu in this film is depicted with the traditional long nose, red face, and feathered wings, and it functions as an agent of karmic justice, punishing wrongdoing in a manner consistent with Buddhist moral teaching. The film was part of a broader wave of kaiden ghost story cinema in the Itenjōbai Wushimouse and Itenjōbai Lyoshimou, a genre that sought to preserve and adapt traditional Japanese folklore for modern audiences. These films were not historically accurate in the scholarly sense, but they were culturally significant, introducing Tengu imagery to audiences who might not have encountered it through oral tradition or religious practice. The Itenjōbai Chishimasu and Itenjōbai Bashimasu saw the Tengu enter the realm of anime and manga, media that would eventually become Japan's most influential cultural exports. One of the earliest anime to feature Tengu prominently was Doron Enma Jian Ken, a supernatural comedy series that aired in Itenjōbai Chishimasu. In this series, Tengu were depicted as minor demons, comic relief characters who possessed supernatural powers, but were easily outwitted by the protagonists. This treatment marked a significant shift from the traditional Tengu mythology. The Tengu were no longer terrifying or morally ambiguous. They were funny, hapless, and ultimately harmless. This transformation reflected broader changes in Japanese society, where traditional folk beliefs were increasingly seen as quaint or nostalgic, rather than as living spiritual realities. The most significant anime representation of Tengu came with the release of Princess Mononoke, directed by Miyazaki Hayao and released in Itenjōbai Joshitsu. While the film does not feature Tengu as characters, it draws heavily on the tradition of mountain spirits and the conflict between human civilization and the forces of nature, the themes that are central to Tengu mythology. Miyazaki's work is notable for its attempt to reclaim the seriousness and complexity of Japanese folklore, to present spirits not as cute or comedic, but as powerful, ancient, and worthy of respect. This approach influenced a generation of creators and helped to shift the cultural conversation around folklore back towards something closer to its original context. In the realm of video games, Tengu have appeared in dozens of titles, beginning with the Itenjōbai Bashitsu game, Tengai Meiki Fei, Zyria Far East of Eden. Zyria, a role-den playing game that featured a protagonist who could transform into a Tengu and gain access to special abilities. This game established a pattern that would be repeated in many later titles. The Tengu as a source of power, a supernatural ally or enemy that the player could interact with, defeat, or in some cases, become. The Tengu in these games were often depicted with exaggerated features, comically long noses, bright red skin, wings that seemed too large for their bodies, and they functioned primarily as obstacles or collectibles, rather than as characters with depth or moral complexity. The Touhou Project, a series of bullet-den hell shooter games that began in Itenjōbai Joshua and has since spawned an enormous fan community, features a character named Aya Shamamaru, a Tengu who works as a journalist and who embodies many of the traditional Tengu traits: arrogance, cunning, a love of gossip and trickery, while also functioning as a comedic and sometimes sympathetic figure. The Touhou series is notable for its deep engagement with Japanese folklore and its willingness to adapt traditional figures in ways that are both playful and respectful. Aya is recognizable as a Tengu, but she is also a fully realized character with her own motivations and personality, not simply a walking symbol. The most commercially successful Tengu representation in video games appeared in the Naruto franchise, which began as a manga in Itenjōbai Joshoujo and has since expanded into anime, films, and games. In Naruto, the concept of Tengu is loosely adapted in the form of various characters and abilities, though the traditional imagery, red faces, long noses, wings, is largely absent. Instead, the Naruto franchise borrows from the broader tradition of ninja folklore, in which Tengu and Yamabushi were conflated with ninja warriors, secretive figures who possessed supernatural abilities and operated outside the law. This conflation has historical roots. Ninja, Yamabushi, and Tengu all occupied similar cultural spaces as marginal, mysterious, and dangerous. But it also represents a significant departure from the original Tengu mythology. The Tengu of Naruto are not spirits of the mountain, but human warriors with special powers. and the moral and spiritual dimensions of the original legends are largely stripped away. The Tengu have also appeared in Western media, though far less frequently and with varying degrees of accuracy. One of the earliest Western engagements with Tengu imagery appeared in the Itenjo by Liu Shizi James Bond film You Only Live Twice, which featured a scene set in a Japanese training camp where the protagonist encounters men dressed in traditional Yamabushi garb, complete with conch-jan shell horns and staffs. The film does not explicitly mention Tengu, but the visual references are clear, and the scene contributed to Western stereotypes about Japanese culture as ancient, mystical, and martial. This representation was superficial and exoticizing, but it introduced Tengu aesthetics to a global audience. A more substantive engagement appeared in the Liancening film, The Great Yokai War, directed by Mikai Takashi, which featured Tengu as major characters in a story about a boy who must save the world of Japanese spirits from an invasion of modern industrial demons. The Tengu in this film are depicted with traditional features: long noses, red faces, wings, and they function as wise, powerful allies who teach the protagonist about the importance of preserving tradition and respecting the natural world. The film was explicitly intended as a work of cultural preservation, an attempt to introduce a new generation of Japanese children to the folklore that their grandparents would have grown up with. It was commercially successful in Japan, but had limited distribution outside Asia. In Western fantasy literature, Tengu have occasionally appeared as minor characters or references, but they have rarely been treated with the depth or seriousness that the tradition warrants. One exception is the Liancening Yishisan novel The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, which includes a character who is described as having been trained by Tengu in the mountains of Japan. The description is brief and does not delve into the specifics of Tengu mythology, but it acknowledges their role as teachers and their association with martial arts and spiritual discipline. More commonly, Tengu appear in tabletop roles and playing games such as Dungeons, Fey Dragons, and Pathfinder, where they are categorized as monsters or adversaries, stripped of their cultural context, and reduced to stat blocks and encounter mechanics. This process of adaptation, from Japanese folklore to global popular culture, has involved significant losses. The Tengu of video games and anime are recognizable by their appearance, but they have largely lost their connection to the mountains, to Buddhist moral teachings, to the Yamabushi tradition, to the idea of the wild as a force that tests and transforms. They have become characters, narrative devices, aesthetic elements. They are no longer gatekeepers or teachers or warnings. They are content. And yet, something has survived. The image of the red Jan-faced figure with the long nose and the wings persists. The association with pride, with arrogance, with the dangers of intellectual pretension persists. The idea that the mountains harbor intelligences that must be respected, that cannot be fully understood or controlled, persists. The Tengu have been transformed by their journey through modern media, but they have not been erased. They remain, in however altered a form, as reminders of a worldview in which the human and the non-Zan human, the rational and the numinous, the known and the unknowable, were not separated by an unbridgeable gulf, but were part of a continuum, a spectrum of being that humans could traverse. At great risk, if they were brave enough or foolish enough to try, the Tengu today function as a kind of mirror, reflecting back to us the distance we have traveled from the worldview that created them. They remind us that there was a time when the mountains were not recreational spaces, when forests were not resources to be managed, when the wild was not something to be conquered or preserved, but something to be negotiated with, something that had agency and intelligence and will. The Tengu are figures from a world in which humans were not the only actors, not the only subjects of history, not the only beings whose perspective mattered. That world is gone. Or nearly so. The mountains of Japan are still there, but they are not what they were. They are crossed by highways and tunnels, dotted with ski resorts and observation towers, mapped and surveyed, and catalogued down to the meter. The forests are managed by the Forestry Agency, their composition and density determined by economic and ecological calculations. The trails that the Yamabushi once walked are now maintained by park services and marked with signs in 4 languages. The Tengu shrines still stand on Mount Takao and Mount Kurama and Mount Otago, and people still leave offerings there. But many of those people are tourists, and their offerings are made not out of fear or respect, but out of a vague sense of cultural obligation, a desire to participate in a tradition whose meaning they no longer fully grasp. And yet, there are still moments when the old logic reasserts itself. A hiker, alone on a mountain trail at dusk, hears something in the trees that does not sound like wind or birds or any animal they can name. A logger, working in a remote forest, feels the distinct sensation of being watched and turns to find nothing there. A climber, attempting a difficult ascent, is overtaken by an inexplicable sense of dread. A certainty that they should not be here, that this space belongs to something else. These moments do not prove the existence of Tengu, but they prove the persistence of the feeling that the Tengu represented. The feeling that we are not alone, that the places we enter do not belong to us, that there are intelligences and powers in the world that operate according to logics we do not understand and cannot control. The Tengu mythology at its core is about humility. It is a reminder that human knowledge is limited, that human power is fragile, that the world is larger and stranger and more complex than any system we can devise to explain it. The monks who feared becoming Tengu were not afraid of literal transformation. They were afraid of losing sight of this truth, of becoming so convinced of their own understanding that they stopped being able to learn. The samurai, who trained with Tengu, were not seeking supernatural power. They were seeking the discipline to master themselves, to move beyond ego and fear and the illusion of control. The Yamabushi, who spent years in the mountains, were not fleeing civilization. They were trying to remember something that civilization had forgotten. Something about the relationship between the human and the more Jan than Jan human, about the ways in which the boundaries between self and world are more permeable than we typically allow. In an era of climate crisis, of ecosystems collapsing, of species vanishing at a rate not seen since the last mass extinction, the Tengu offer a kind of wisdom that we have largely lost. They remind us that the natural world is not a backdrop for human activity, not a collection of resources. It is a community of beings, some of which we recognize and name, and some of which we do not. And our survival depends on our ability to live in relationship with that community, to negotiate rather than dominate, to listen rather than assume we already know. The Tengu are creatures of red faces and long noses, of wings and talons and mocking laughter. But they are also, and perhaps more importantly, creatures of thresholds. They stand at the boundary between the village and the forest, between the monastery and the wilderness, between the known and the unknown. They mark the places where our maps run out, where our certainties dissolve, where we are forced to admit that we do not have all the answers. And they ask us a question, the same question they have been asking for more than 1,000 years. What do you become when you step across that boundary? What do you lose, and what do you gain? When you leave the safety of the settled world and enter the space where the mountain's law is the only law that applies. The answer, if there is one, is not written in any text. It is written in the forest themselves, in the high country where the air is thin and the wind carries voices that might be human and might not. It is waiting for those who are willing to climb, to listen, to risk transformation. And it is carried, still, in the image of the red Jan-faced figure with the wings and the knowing smile, watching from the trees, laughing at our certainties, reminding us that the world is still wild, still alive, still full of intelligences that we have not named and cannot control. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore myths and mysterious creatures. See you next time.